Have you ever chosen to stay when everyone else walked away? I'm not asking if you've ever loved deeply or suffered greatly, though perhaps you have. I'm asking something more hidden, something quieter. Have you ever stood at a crossroads where everything in front of you looked empty, no future, no logic, no guarantee, and still you stayed? Not because it made sense, not because you were strong, but because, somewhere deep within, a small voice whispered, "This is where you're meant to be." We live in a culture obsessed with walking away. If something hurts you, cut it off. If someone doesn't understand you, let them go. If a place feels too hard, too heavy, too hollow, leave. Start over. Protect your peace. And yes, sometimes leaving is wisdom. Sometimes walking away is freedom. There are seasons where release is the very thing God is asking of you, but not always. Not every battle is meant to be escaped. Not every hard place is meant to be abandoned. Because what if there's another kind of strength the world doesn't recognize? The kind that doesn't announce itself, but stays quietly rooted. The kind that doesn't feel like victory, but is still holy. What if staying when there's no applause, no promise, no clarity isn't weakness at all, but worship? This is not a message for the ones who are coasting through life. This is for the ones who are still showing up. The ones still loving when it hurts. Still working when it feels thankless. Still holding on when everything inside them wants to run. Maybe that's you. Maybe you're standing in a relationship that feels one-sided, but you haven't stopped hoping. Maybe you're in a job that drains you, but you stay because something tells you your purpose isn't finished. Maybe your field is simply your own soul surviving through grief, depression, silence, or the absence of answers. You haven't seen the harvest, but you haven't left either. And if that's you, then I need you to know there is a story written for you. Not a story of instant breakthrough or dramatic miracles, but a story about faithfulness when no one is watching. It begins not with triumph, but with famine, with a foreign land, a funeral, and a bitter woman named Naomi. It begins with 2 daughters-in-law standing in grief, and one of them, Ruth, choosing to stay. But before we tell her story, let me tell you this. Ruth's greatness wasn't in the miracle. It was in the decision. The silent, unglamorous, lonely decision to stay. She didn't know she was stepping into destiny. She didn't know her name would be written into the lineage of a king. She simply heard a whisper, and she didn't ignore it. If you've ever stayed not for applause, not for validation, but because something sacred told you, don't leave yet, then this is for you, because the story of Ruth is not just a history, it's a map. And maybe, just maybe, it leads straight to the field where you are standing now. We live in a time that worships the exit. Leaving has become a virtue. Walk away, they say. Walk away from anything that drains you, anything that delays you, anything that dares to demand more of you than it gives. The world has mastered the language of boundaries and detachment, of cutting ties and closing doors. We scroll past slogans like, "Protect your peace," and "You don't owe anyone anything." And we start to believe that every burden is a curse and every inconvenience a signal to flee. But what if the divine speaks in different terms? What if not every hard place is meant to be escaped? What if God is found not just in the open doors, but in the ones you choose to keep knocking on, even when they remain closed? The truth is, the kingdom of heaven runs on a rhythm that defies modern logic. While the world glorifies departure, Scripture is full of stories that sanctify staying. Stories of people who could have walked away, who had every reason to, but chose instead to remain, and in their staying, they stepped into something sacred. Jesus stayed in the garden when his soul was crushed with sorrow. He didn't run from the weight of the cross. He prayed, "If it's possible, take this cup from me." But he stayed. Mary stood at the foot of that same cross, while others ran for safety. The prophets Jeremiah, Isaiah, Hosea were called not to escape, but to endure. They remained with a people who rejected them, suffered ridicule without reward, and still obeyed because God had planted them there. Even the Ark of the Covenant had poles. Why? Because God's presence wasn't meant to be dropped in and out like a guest, it was meant to dwell, to remain, to abide. So maybe you're not wrong for staying. Maybe the world calls it foolish, but heaven calls it faithful. Maybe you've been conditioned to believe that discomfort means misalignment, but what if it's actually the birthplace of transformation? What if the presence of pain doesn't mean you're failing it, means you're in the middle of something holy? There is a strength that doesn't shout. There is a power that doesn't move on, but moves in deeper. This is the theology of staying. Not staying in abuse, not staying in destruction, but staying in assignment. Staying in obedience. Staying in the process that hasn't finished working on you yet. It's not about being passive, it's about being planted. So many want the promise, but few want the patience. We want the glory, but not the grit. We want the crown, but skip the wilderness. But Ruth's story, like every true story of faith, doesn't begin with arrival. It begins with a decision to remain when the rest of the world says, "You'd be better off walking away." And that's where we're going next. Into a story that doesn't sparkle on the surface, but breaks open something eternal. Into the life of a woman who stayed, not because she had answers, but because she had a vow. We live in a time that worships the exit. Leaving has become a virtue. Walk away, they say. Walk away from anything that drains you, anything that delays you, anything that dares to demand more of you than it gives. The world has mastered the language of boundaries and detachment, of cutting ties and closing doors. We scroll past slogans like, "Protect your peace" and "You don't owe anyone anything." And we start to believe that every burden is a curse, and every inconvenience a signal to flee. But what if the divine speaks in different terms? What if not every hard place is meant to be escaped? What if God is found not just in the open doors, but in the ones you choose to keep knocking on, even when they remain closed? The truth is, the kingdom of heaven runs on a rhythm that defies modern logic. While the world glorifies departure, Scripture is full of stories that sanctify staying. Stories of people who could have walked away, who had every reason to, but chose instead to remain. And in their staying, they stepped into something sacred. Jesus stayed in the garden when his soul was crushed with sorrow. He didn't run from the weight of the cross. He prayed, "If it's possible, take this cup from me." But he stayed. Mary stood at the foot of that same cross, while others ran for safety. The prophets Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Hosea were called not to escape, but to endure. They remained with a people who rejected them, suffered ridicule without reward, and still obeyed because God had planted them there. Even the Ark of the Covenant had poles. Why? Because God's presence wasn't meant to be dropped in and out like a guest, it was meant to dwell, to remain, to abide. So maybe you're not wrong for staying. Maybe the world calls it foolish, but heaven calls it faithful. Maybe you've been conditioned to believe that discomfort means misalignment, but what if it's actually the birthplace of transformation? What if the presence of pain doesn't mean you're failing, it means you're in the middle of something holy? There is a strength that doesn't shout. There is a power that doesn't move on, but moves in deeper. This is the theology of staying. Not staying in abuse, not staying in destruction, but staying in assignment, staying in obedience, staying in the process that hasn't finished working on you yet. It's not about being passive, it's about being planted. So many want the promise, but few want the patience. We want the glory, but not the grit. We want the crown, but skip the wilderness. But Ruth's story, like every true story of faith, doesn't begin with arrival. It begins with a decision to remain when the rest of the world says, "You'd be better off walking away." And that's where we're going next. Into a story that doesn't sparkle on the surface, but breaks open something eternal. Into the life of a woman who stayed, not because she had answers, but because she had a vow. Ruth didn't arrive with banners. She didn't enter history with status, miracles, or angelic pronouncements. Her name was not spoken with reverence, only suspicion. She came from Moab, a land cursed in the minds of many. She was a foreigner, a widow, an outsider. No titles, no children, no promises, just grief layered upon grief. Her story begins in famine, in funerals, in a quiet household of heartbreak. Her husband had died, her father-in-law had died, her brother-in-law had died. And now, her mother-in-law, Naomi, broken by sorrow, had made up her mind to go back to her homeland Bethlehem, back to a place she had once fled. But this time, Naomi carried no hope in her heart. She would return not in fullness, but in bitterness. "Call me Mara," she would later say, "for the Lord has made my life very bitter." As Naomi prepared to leave, she turned to her daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, and released them. "Go back to your own people," she said. "You still have time. You're still young. Start over. There's nothing left for you here." Orpah wept and obeyed. She kissed Naomi goodbye and returned to her family. It was the expected choice, the rational choice, the safe choice. But Ruth did something that startled even Naomi. She didn't just hesitate, she clung. With arms, with tears, with something fierce in her soul, she refused to let go. "Don't urge me to leave you," she said. "Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." It wasn't a speech, it was a vow. A sacred, trembling vow made not out of certainty, but out of covenant. Ruth wasn't following the opportunity. She was walking into obscurity. She wasn't choosing safety. She was embracing sacrifice. She would be a stranger in a strange land. She had no prospects, no protection, no reason except something in her spirit that whispered, "Stay." Let's pause here not to explain, but to feel. Can you imagine what that cost her? She was leaving her entire identity behind, her language, her culture, her home. She was stepping into a future that offered her no applause and no reward. There was no assurance that she would be received, no sign that she would be honored. All she had was a woman too bitter to bless her, and a vow too sacred to break. But what Ruth understood, what so few of us are taught us, that love is not measured by ease, loyalty is not tested by comfort, and faith, true faith, is not built on clarity, but on conviction. Ruth wasn't following a plan. She was following a whisper. And so, side by side, one bitter, one brave, they walked into Bethlehem, dust on their feet, hunger in their bones, and no plan but presence. There was no warm welcome waiting, no divine sign in the sky, just the ordinary ache of survival. And yet, that choice to stay, that bold, quiet act of faithfulness, would become the doorway to a destiny she could not see. Ruth didn't know she was walking into the lineage of the Messiah. She didn't know that her name would be etched into the holy bloodline of kings. She wasn't trying to be remembered. She was simply refusing to abandon the assignment she felt in her soul. And maybe that's where your story starts, too, not with triumph, but with tears, not with clarity, but with covenant, not with a map, but with a whisper. Because sometimes, the ones who change history aren't the ones who rise, but the ones who remain. There was no fanfare when Ruth stepped into Bethlehem. No one sang. No one welcomed her home. In fact, it wasn't her home at all. She was a Moabite in a land that didn't forget old wounds. The air may have held the scent of harvest, but for Ruth, the ground beneath her feet was still barren. All she had was her vow and the silence. So she did what she could. She rose early. She walked into fields that didn't belong to her. She bent low to gather what others had dropped, scraps, remnants, forgotten pieces. She didn't demand attention. She didn't explain herself. She didn't ask to be seen. She moved through the dust with quiet dignity, not because she was full of hope, but because she was full of love. Love for Naomi. Love for a God she barely knew. Love that didn't depend on applause. In his book, The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis reflects on the nature of unseen virtue and writes, "The load, or weight, or burden of my neighbor's glory should be laid daily on my back, a load so heavy that only humility can carry it." He reminds us that true glory is often hidden, that the most eternal acts may be those performed without audience or acclaim. Like Ruth, who bore the weight of sacred love in silence, some of the heaviest crowns are forged in dust and secrecy, And that's the part of the story we often pass over too quickly. We look for miracles, we wait for turning points. But Ruth's greatness was not in a single grand act. It wasn't in some divine breakthrough with lights and angels and sudden reversal. Her greatness was forged in the monotony, in the repetition, in the field, because it is in the field where no one claps and no one watches that faith is revealed. We forget this. We chase visibility. We want our efforts to be noticed, our faithfulness to be rewarded. But heaven's eyes are not distracted by platforms or applause. Heaven watches the field, the place of unseen endurance, the place where the heart is tested, not by fire but by dust. The kind of dust that settles on your shoulders after long days of giving when no one gives back. The kind of dust that gathers on your soul when you serve and sacrifice without return. That's the dust of the field. And yet, it was therein that very dust that a man named Boaz took notice. Not because Ruth was trying to impress, not because she wore something beautiful or said something clever. He saw her kindness, her courage, her loyalty to Naomi. He noticed the way she moved without needing to be noticed. And suddenly, something shifted. But here is what matters most. Ruth did not enter that field to be chosen. She did not show up to be seen. She came to survive. She came to serve. She came to gather what others left behind, not knowing that heaven had already written her name into a story that would echo through generations. Because that's how grace often moves. Quietly, through footsteps in dust, through mornings that feel empty, through acts of service that seem thankless, through those who stay when others leave, through those who kneel in fields no one celebrates. And maybe that's where you are right now. Maybe you're in your own field, not of barley but of daily obedience. Maybe your hands are tired, maybe your heart is questioning, maybe your faith feels small. But listen closely. Heaven is still watching the field of your perseverance, the field of your silent offerings, the field where you keep showing up, even when no one says thank you. And, just like Ruth, you may not be here to be seen, but you are being written into something eternal. You may not be standing in Bethlehem, you may not be gathering barley beneath a sun that doesn't care, but you too have a field. Your field might look like a job that no longer sparks purpose, but still demands everything you have. It might be a marriage weathering storm after storm with no sign of blue sky. Maybe it's a child you keep praying for, long after your heart has grown tired of waiting. Or maybe your field is internal a battle with depression, anxiety, shame, or silence. A place where you get up, not out of inspiration, but out of obedience. Where you keep going, not because it's easy, but because deep down, something holy tells you not to stop. And yet it feels like nothing is changing. No answers, no fire from heaven, no open doors. Just repetition, just sweat, just survival. And in that kind of season, it's easy to wonder, is this still worth it? Am I still seen? Is any of this leading anywhere at all? Let me tell you what Ruth didn't know. She didn't know her tears would water the ground that birthed kings. She didn't know her gathering would echo into eternity. She didn't know her pain was part of a prophecy she couldn't yet see. All she knew was the next step, and she took it. In The Problem of Pain, C.S. speaks to the mystery of suffering and writes, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. Oh, Ruth could not have known it, but the sorrow she carried was not just the sound of loss, it was the voice of God, calling her into a deeper place. Her pain was not punishment, it was preparation. It was the megaphone through which heaven announced a destiny still hidden beneath the dust. You don't have to see the end to keep showing up in the middle. You don't have to feel triumphant to be walking in purpose. Sometimes, the most spiritual thing you can do is to stay where God planted you and trust that the story is not done. Because God does not place people in fields without purpose. Maybe you haven't seen the harvest yet. Maybe the soil feels dry and the sky feels quiet. But what if the silence around you isn't rejection? What if it's preparation? What if the ache you feel isn't the end, but the tension before the breakthrough? What if the thing that looks like obscurity is actually divine hiding, because God hides the most precious things before revealing them? Ruth didn't know she was being hidden for royal bloodlines. She didn't know her ordinary acts of loyalty were being recorded in heaven. She didn't know that her yes in obscurity would become a doorway for redemption itself. And yes, you don't know what's being written about your field right now, but heaven does. So do not despise the place you're in. Do not curse the dust or the silence or the repetition. This may not feel like destiny, but that's the miracle of the kingdom. It rarely feels like destiny when it begins. The fields of faith never look like glory. They look like survivors. They look like tears. They look like you, standing exactly where you are now, but this is not where it ends. There comes a moment in every life of quiet obedience when something in the atmosphere begins to shift. It doesn't always happen with lightning or applause. There is no drum roll, no prophetic announcement, no sudden wind to confirm the invisible. But deep in the fabric of the story, something begins to turn. It's subtle, it's sacred. It's the moment heaven leans in, and it only happens to those who have stayed. For Ruth, that moment didn't arrive when she first entered Bethlehem. It didn't come when she made her vow or followed Naomi or crossed a border in grief. No, it came much later, after the long days in the field, after the bruised hands and sore feet, after her kindness had become routine and her loyalty had been worn smooth by silence. The shift came in obscurity. And it came not because Ruth did anything new, but because she hadn't left, because she remained. And that's how heaven works. Not through showmanship or ambition, but through faithfulness. God moves through those who continue to show up when it seems pointless, through those who keep giving when nothing comes back, through those who stay, not because it's comfortable, but because something sacred anchors them there. Ruth didn't labor to be noticed. She wasn't performing. She didn't rise each morning thinking today might be the breakthrough. She rose because it was the right thing to do. She bent low in the field, not knowing that every handful of barley was a chapter in a story far greater than she imagined. You see, Ruth wasn't just gathering grain, she was gathering history. Every motion, every step, every silent offering was being watched not by crowds, but by heaven. And when Boaz finally noticed her, it wasn't her beauty or wit that caught his attention. It was her character, her courage, her consistency. He saw in her what God had already seen from the beginning. A woman formed not by spotlight, but by the field. This is what I want you to understand. The sacred shift does not come to the flashy, it comes to the faithful. The kingdom of God doesn't operate on viral timelines or public recognition. It honors the hidden ones, the ones who serve in silence, the ones who carry burdens with no parade, the ones who stay planted where God put them, long after the feeling has left, long after others have walked away. You may think your story is delayed. You may feel like nothing is changing, but what if the delay is divine? What if the very field that looks so barren is actually the womb of destiny? What if your staying is the sign that heaven has marked you for something greater, not because you earned it, but because you endured? In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis reflects on what it means to truly walk with God and writes, "The real test of being in the presence of God is that you either forget about yourself altogether or see yourself as a small, dirty object. It is better to forget about yourself altogether." And perhaps that is what the field teaches best, not how to be seen, but how to be emptied. Not how to rise in your own strength, but how to forget yourself in sacred trust. Ruth was not chasing destiny. She was surrendering to something greater than herself. And in doing so, she became someone heaven could trust with history. There is a kind of strength the world will never teach you. It is not loud, it is not popular, it is not quick, but it is holy. It is the kind of strength that keeps showing up, the kind that bends down in hard places, the kind that honors a vow, even when it hurts. The kind that says, I don't see the harvest yet, but I know the God of the harvest, and I will not abandon the field. And this is where everything begins to change, not because of strategy, not because of speed, but because of the presence. The field didn't change, Ruth did, and that is what drew heaven close. Ruth became the kind of person God could trust with a legacy. She became the kind of soul who could carry royal blood. And she did it not by striving, but by staying. So if you've been wondering whether your endurance matters, whether your silent loyalty, your unseen service, your sleepless nights, your private obedience count for anything at all, I say this with reverence. Yes, it matters. Every act of faith in the field is a seed. Every quiet sacrifice is a stone in the foundation of something eternal. And though the world may never applaud you, God is not blind to the field you refuse to abandon. The sacred shift comes slowly, but when it comes, it redefines everything. It elevates the forgotten. It lifts the bowed low. It reveals that God was never absent, he was watching, weeping with you, counting every tear, recording every step, preparing something holy in the soil of your exhaustion. The moment you thought was pointless may be the very moment heaven calls a turning point. So stay when it's dry, stay when it's silent, stay when it's ordinary, because God does not anoint those who quit the field too soon. He crowns those who are still standing in the dust when destiny walks in. What if the place you're standing in right now, the quiet, ordinary, uncelebrated field you wake up to each morning, is not the end of your story, but the beginning of your becoming? What if the very silence that surrounds you is not heaven's absence, but heaven's preparation? We often assume that if God were truly moving, we would feel it. We imagine breakthroughs arrive with noise, with flashes of certainty, with moments so unmistakable we could never doubt again. But in the kingdom of God, the most sacred shifts begin in silence. They begin in dust. They begin when someone keeps showing up not for applause, not for reward, not even for answers, but because they know deep in their soul that they've been planted on holy ground. You may not see it yet, but the field you've been asked to tend this season of quiet obedience, this job that demands more than it returns, this relationship that stretches your capacity to love, this ache that keeps you on your knees, not meaningless. It is not wasted. It is not a detour. This may be the exact place where your name is being etched into a story you cannot yet see. Because legacy doesn't begin with recognition. It begins with surrender. Destiny is not unlocked by striving, it is entrusted to those who endure. You're not late. You're not forgotten. You're not disqualified. You are standing in the very kind of place where heaven begins to move. Ruth had no idea she was being woven into the royal line of David. She had no idea that her quiet yes in the shadows would become part of a lineage that led straight to the Messiah. She wasn't chasing legacy or trying to be significant. She was just being faithful, gathering scraps, walking beside grief, honoring her vow, and trusting that obedience mattered even when the outcome was hidden. And in the eyes of God, that was enough. More than enough. It was her endurance, not her status, that caught heaven's attention. It was her presence in the field, not her power, that shifted the story. And the same could be true for you. What if the love you keep giving in silence, the sacrifices you make without thanks, the integrity you hold on to when no one else is watching, what if those are the very things heaven is using to write the next chapter of your life? What if your field, right now, is the proving ground for promises too holy to be rushed? What if your refusal to leave is the very evidence that you've been chosen for something deeper? This is not a motivational message. This is a divine invitation. God is still searching the fields, not for talent, not for charm, not for those who seek the spotlight, but for those who stay, for the ones who keep tending the ground they were assigned, even when it looks barren, for the ones who say, I will remain here not because it's easy, but because God has not released me. This is the kind of faith that shapes history, the kind that births kings and carries redemption. And it rarely looks glorious in the beginning. Maybe heaven is whispering your name even now. Not to rush, not to run. Not to rise prematurely, but to remain. To trust that you are not hidden, you are being held. That you are not overlooked, you are being refined. That the very dust beneath your feet is holy, because God has chosen to meet you here. So don't move unless God moves you. Don't abandon the field just because it's quiet. Don't walk away simply because it's hard. Sometimes the place that feels like a delay is actually divine protection. Sometimes the very ground that feels like suffering is the soil where sacred legacy is born. Sometimes the most supernatural thing you can do is stay rooted in the last place God called you until He calls you again. This may not feel like destiny, but neither did Bethlehem to Ruth. And still, she stayed. And because she stayed, everything changed. So here you are, still standing, still breathing, still in the field. Maybe no one knows what it has cost you to remain. Maybe they only see the surface, your calm eyes, your steady hands, your quiet perseverance. They do not see the battle inside. They do not hear the arguments you've had with God in the dark. They do not feel the ache you carry in silence, the ache of dreams delayed, the ache of prayers unanswered, the ache of obedience that feels invisible. But heaven sees, and heaven remembers. Let this be the moment you stop doubting the worth of your endurance. Let this be the hour when you stop questioning if your faithfulness matters. It matters more than you know. It matters not because you've been strong, but because you haven't quit. It matters not because you've seen fruit, but because you've continued to sow in the absence of it. It matters not because the field feels glorious, but because you chose to remain on ground that felt forgotten, and you called it holy anyway. You are not weak because you're tired. You are not lost because the road is long. You are not failing because you feel unseen. In fact, you may be closer to a breakthrough than you realize. Not because the harvest is near, but because you are becoming the kind of person who can be trusted with it. That's what this has always been about, not just what God is building through you, but what God is building in you. And nothing shapes the soul like staying in the field when everything in you wants to run. So stay. Stay even when it's quiet. Stay even when it costs you. Stay even when it feels like no one claps, no one thanks you, and no one notices, because this is how heaven moves. Slowly, silently, through the unseen, through the infamous, through the uncelebrated, through people like Ruth, through people like you. This field may not look like a promise, but it is pregnant with it. This ground may look dry, but underneath is the water that will one day rise. This season may seem silent, but it is heavy with unseen angels, with sacred conversations, with divine shifts you have not yet glimpsed. So I bless you not with escape, but with endurance. Not with applause, but with peace. Not with a lightning bolt, but with a deeper root. May you stay where you've been called until heaven releases you. May you find joy, not in the outcome, but in the faithfulness itself. May you hear God's whisper more clearly than the noise of fear. And may you one day look back on this season and realize, this was the place where everything changed. You are not forgotten. You are not forsaken. You are not buried. You are being planted. And the God who saw Ruth in the field is the same God who sees you now. He is not late. He is not distant. He is writing something through your staying that could never be written through your escape. In his timeless sermon, The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis writes with breathtaking reverence, "To be loved by God, not merely pitied, but delighted in as an artist delights in his work." The promise almost seems incredible. And yet, this is the mystery of your field, that in all your silence, sacrifice, and unseen faithfulness, heaven does not merely tolerate you, it delights in you. Not as a project, not as a burden, but as a masterpiece in progress. You are not being overlooked, you are being formed. You are not merely surviving, you are becoming the kind of soul God Himself rejoices over. So stay in the field, stay in love, stay in hope, stay in the place God last whispered until He speaks again. The harvest is His, the timing is His, the field is holy, and you are still being chosen. Amen.